Hi, I'm Michael Andrake from Ground Zero, Minnesota. Welcome to Rethinking the World. We're going to continue our discussion of spies and crime today with Gene Wheaton, a former criminal investigations person for the Army and the Marine Corps and the Air Force. And we already got into your background, Gene, so let's get right in where we left off. You heard conversations about actually fomenting militia-type activity by senior people in the intelligence community. And why were they interested in doing that?
They wanted to, it's part of a policy, a philosophy that was created by Richard Helms and George Bush and Ted Shackley and a group of them, which is contained in Shackley's little book called The Third Option. They wanted to create domestic unrest in the United States so that the people would back off on some of their constitutional rights. They wanted to create fear in America so that the people would ask them to come in and protect them. And this is a philosophy that these guys said that they could create by causing domestic unrest in America and by infiltrating militia groups and then causing events to happen either through the militia or blaming them on the militia. Then they could have a boogeyman for the people and the media to point a finger at while these guys stayed in the background stirring things up. And as I was present in Washington when they planned setting up some of these militia movements, in fact I was offered a commission as a colonel in a couple of the militias and I turned them down. And they discussed how they wanted secret police powers in America. Not just in America, this part of this whole New World Order thing where they wanted to internationalize America, and some of the difficulties were the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, that they figured out ways to make it an antiquated document by creating so much fear across the country that the people would be willing to give up a great deal of their individual rights to have these people protected.
And I want to emphasize quickly that observers on both the far right and the far left are in agreement that we have a creeping police state happening. They're differ in detail, but they're alarmed by the development of prisons and the erosion of civil liberties, and the CIPA, that's the Classified Information Procedures Act that you mentioned, that denies some rights that we've all taken for granted to government employees. Why don't you explain that particular item quickly for us?
Well, CIPA is the Classified Information Procedures Act, and it was through networking and lobbying on the Hill with Congress and the Justice Department, the covert operators got that law passed as more or less an equivalent of the British Official Secrets Act, so that they could control the media in the United States and control the courts. And they have special national security courts set up with a CIPA-approved judge controlled by the intelligence community to prosecute cases that they call national security. And it's so outlandish that it's totally in violation of the Constitution, because the defendant and his lawyer have no right to cross-examine witnesses. They do not even have to, they are not necessarily allowed to even know the identity of their accusers. And there are several intelligence officers and military officers and federal agents in serving prison sentences in the United States under the CIPA Act where they had no open trial. There's closed trials, and that is just part of the whole plan of controlling the judicial
And that's
system.
a classic symptom of the police state, when you have controlled trials without due process. And I can say that this was so shocking when I first heard of it, that I did get a person who's an editor for a religious digest, and also a graduate. He teaches graduate students in journalism how to go search. And he did an internet search on CIPA and uncovered over 500 stories, mostly in little places, but that verify what you just said, there are people in jail today that have had no chance to see their accuser or the evidence that put them in prison.
Some of them are rotting away in solitary confinement,
right,
in federal prisons.
And some of them are whistleblowers. Their actual sin was talking publicly about some wrongdoing.
Yes. See, under the law, you can't use national security to conceal criminal activity. And yet the covert operators and the Justice Department, as their action arm, will nail a federal agent to the wall or a military officer to the wall and put him away in prison under the Classified Information Procedures Act if he discloses the dirty wrongdoing of these guys. And the story never sees the light of day. A big concern I have is the creeping military involvement in
law enforcement,
in the United States. Now, I am a police officer and a retired military investigator, and I teach criminal justice courses part-time, undergraduate and graduate courses to police officers here in Southern California. And I am a right-wing, conservative, patriotic individual, so I'm not bad-mouthing these guys as some sort of a left-wing liberal, because I'm not. I'm concerned with the Constitution. The way they started getting the military involved, and it is a violation of federal law for the military to get involved under the Posse Comitatus Act, for the military to get involved in civilian law enforcement in the United States. And that goes clear back to the 1800s. But they first got a wedge in by starting to use inactive National Guardsmen to get involved in drug interdiction on the borders. And then they got reservists involved. And then they got active duty military people involved down in Central America, where they have a secret war going on down in Peru right now. And after they got them involved there, then they're conditioning the American people.
Them back.
Yeah.
Right.
So now they're flying military operations around the country, not just against drug smugglers, but against the militia, against these Branch Davidians and everything, and it's wrong. You know?
It is wrong, and the war on drugs has been especially useful as a tool to wage war on civil liberties in this country. Now, I'm going to want to come back to the media, because that plays a very important role in all this, as you know. But I don't want to lose sight of the militia phenomenon. You mentioned that they had an interest in encouraging this. You've also had a chance to look personally at the Oklahoma City bombing and the World Trade Center bombing, a couple of important acts in this whole scene. Do these fit together in any way?
Yes, I went to New York City on the Trade Center bombing, and I was looking at particularly the FBI's chief informant, who was part of the inner circle of the Middle East guys who blew up the Trade Center, and his name was Imad Salim, and he was an FBI informant. But I happen to know from my Middle East background and having traveled to Egypt on intelligence and military-related programs that Imad Salim was a member of the what they call a TRD, the Technical Research Department, which is the Egyptian equivalent of the CIA, and it's under the control of the CIA. They fund them. They tell them what
it's under the control of the CIA.
Yes, the covert operators, not the 95% of CIA analysts who are honorable people.
I understand. This is not rare around the world, I understand, in terms of agencies with whom we have a close liaison.
No, we and the British more or less control the intelligence covert operations of the world.
Okay, so you were on the Trade Center bombing, and this guy is working for Egyptian intelligence.
Yes, and he's the nephew of Colonel. This guy's name is Imad Salim. His uncle, Hussein Salim, another colonel in TRD, was the partner of Ted Shackley, George Bush, Ed Wilson, Dick Secord in the old EDSCO scam, which was part of the Ed Wilson case. And he was under the control of the agency, Shackley and Klein's crowd. So you have a networking of the same people that were involved in the scandals of the 70s when George Bush was CIA director, also controlling their chief informant who instigated the Trade Center bombing. Now, these Middle Easterners set that bomb off in the Trade Center, but Imad Salim, and this has come out in the court during his trial, his attorneys came to me and interviewed me, and I gave them documentation showing his connection to these covert operators. they scammed the FBI. The CIA covert operators were really controlling the man that the FBI thought they were controlling.
Gene, you were talking about the World Trade Center bombing and some connections with intelligence agencies there. Tell us a little bit about the Oklahoma City bombing, because I know you've been retained to go out and take a fresh look at that.
Well, as you know, I'm from Oklahoma, and I grew up in Tulsa and was a police officer there, and my whole family are teachers and firemen, and everybody I run with is that or a journalist in Oklahoma. So I'm pretty well connected back there. I was first asked to go back there by Bob Guccione of Penthouse Magazine. He paid my way back. The next time I went back for another television network, can't remember who it was at the time. And the third time I was invited back there by officials from the state of Oklahoma, attorneys involved in the Oklahoma City bombing, because they were dissatisfied with the FBI's focus on the investigation, or lack of focus on the people around John Doe number 2. So I've been back there 3 times extensively on that thing. And there is a group of covert operators in Washington, D.C. who have a major operation going on in Oklahoma. I won't get into the full details of it right now, but the people involved are Brent Scowcroft, the former National Security Advisor to George Bush, Mitch Rogovan, who was Bush's CIA legal counsel when Bush was CIA director, a guy named David C. Miller Jr., who was the number 3 man in the National Security Council. They've created a company called American Equity Investors, AEI. The umbrella corporation that set it up is a thing called CT Corporation out of Delaware, which is the same company that set up Ed Wilson's companies. And they moved into Oklahoma several years ago, buying into oil companies. Little companies are going to go broke, mom and pop operations. And they have set up, and Bud McFarland was the liaison flying back and forth between Washington and Oklahoma to service these
move
companies.
us a little forward out of the details into why this is important to the scene there.
Well, the important to the scene is because John Doe number 2 is being manipulated by a Middle East faction that is under the control of the covert operators in Washington, D.C., and they don't want to look for him.
But John Doe number 2 is a real person. There's a lot of eyewitnesses.
He's a real person, yes. And there's a faction around John Doe number 2 that the FBI in Oklahoma City won't look into. Now, I have sent letters and faxes to the FBI in Oklahoma City. They came out here and invited me for an interview one time, but it was a bizarre interview. They should have interviewed somebody in Oklahoma who was my source, which I gave them. A member of my family. And instead they came out and talked to me and then just dropped the whole thing. Members of the Oklahoma State Legislature and attorneys involved with the families of some of the deceased people in the Oklahoma City bombing are very unhappy with the case, and none of the people around John Doe number 2 who could identify him or even describe him were ever called before the grand jury, and there's nobody pursuing those leads.
Now, I want to just spend maybe a minute more on this because we've got even bigger things to get to, but I saw a tape produced by one of those legislators that you mentioned, Charles Key, out of his frustration with the way it was being investigated, and it had a General Parton, a 34-year Air Force general who was in charge of demolitions testing, and he produced a report that raises serious questions about whether the alleged bomb could have done the damage. Have you seen that report? Is it a credible assessment?
I've not only seen the report, I've met with General Parton back in Washington, and he and I correspond. General Parton is considered, and I didn't know who he was, so I checked with the Pentagon. The Pentagon is, people that I have contact with in the Pentagon have assured me that he is the U.S. military's top explosives expert in the world. Ph.D. Everything from nuclear devices to firecrackers. And I have seen his report. He gave his report to Congress. The people who are saying he is a discredited witness, not a single one of them have submitted an expert that will contradict his report.
Okay, now here's the real punchline to me, because everything I've heard about him is exemplary, that he's a true pro and he knows what he's talking about, and this is very serious assessment. and yet we have not seen discussion of it. No discussion of it have I seen anywhere on the major media, on television, or in the major newspapers. Are they so powerful that they can suppress something like that?
Yes. The billions of dollars that are profits off of weapon sales and drug smuggling sales are used to invest in stock in major American corporations, including the umbrella corporations above the national media. I have had direct experience with people from some of these Fortune 500 companies who the covert operators have people on the board of directors
right.
of, and if a media outlet, let's say a CBS station in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, goes too far in an investigation, they will send lawyers out there from Washington to talk to the station manager. And if he doesn't back off on the investigation,
story, right.
or fire the journalist that's looking into it,
mm-hmm.
or promote him or transfer him, then the station manager is going to lose his job. And these guys have families to support just
right.
like everybody else.
Now I want to push you a little bit on that, if that's okay.
Sure.
We know GE owns NBC now, Westinghouse owns CBS, and you were telling us in the break here a very specific story about Westinghouse. Are you prepared to share that with the world?
Sure. In the spring of 1986, I was asked by a covert operator in Washington, D.C. to withdraw $35,000 out of Riggs Bank in Washington, D.C. In increments of less than $10,000 apiece, so I wouldn't have to file a Treasury
mm-hmm.
transaction report, and to take that money to Florida and to give it to a vice president of Westinghouse Corporation to pay off an Egyptian general on a Pentagon foreign military sales contract. Had I done that on my own, it would have been a felony, and they were trying to set me up to commit a felony so
mm-hmm.
that they could get me to back off and they could control me.
It's always convoluted spy business.
I went to the Washington field office of the FBI with the $35,000 in brand new $100 bills, spread it out on their desk, and insisted that they get photographers in there and photograph that money and notify their Orlando, Florida office that I was coming
mm-hmm.
and back me up when I delivered that money on this payoff. I flew to Florida.
They weren't real happy about this, I gather, but they did.
The FBI
cooperate.
tried to talk me out of
right.
even doing it, and that I insisted on
mm-hmm.
doing. So when I arrived in Orlando, it was on a weekend, and two FBI agents met me at the stairwell of the airplane, took me in an FBI car to the Orlando field office, wired me up with a body mic and tape recorder.
Mm-hmm.
I went out to a hotel at Disney World, met the Westinghouse vice president, counted out $35,000 in cash and $100 bills, and I told him I had the receipt for this money, so I wanted an accountability
mm-hmm.
of it. So he signed me a receipt for 35,000 spare parts. And that money was to be given to an Egyptian Air Force general to pay off on a contract to modify the cockpits of all the Egyptian Air Force's C-130 aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
I gave the tape, after the payoff was made, I gave the tape recorder and the tapes and the receipt to the FBI in Orlando. I came back to Washington. The local FBI agent that I had been working with in Washington, D.C. Came to my office and asked me if I'd put a tape recorder on my telephone for a couple of weeks, which I did, talking between me
mm-hmm.
and Cairo, Egypt. And then nothing was ever done. They never took a statement from me. I had a secretary that was a witness to this. She went to the bank with me when
mm-hmm.
I got the money. Nobody was ever prosecuted for it, and it's a major felony to pay off anyone on a foreign military sales case. Now, this was Westinghouse Corporation,
right.
which is Umbrella Corporation, which owns CBS. So, and they have so many multi-billion-dollar defense contracts for everything from equipment on ships, submarines, airplanes, that the National Security Agency, the CIA, and the Pentagon have a tremendous financial leverage on Westinghouse
mm-hmm.
Corporation. Covert operators have bought stock in Westinghouse, have a man on the board of directors, and anytime any media outlet below them gets too energetic, they'll let them do a few investigative reports as long as they don't keep repeating the same one like they did Watergate. They'll let them do a one-time thing, and then as long as they drop it after that, they can do it. But if they want to do follow-ups to show the seriousness of it, then they'll get concerned and they shut it down.
Right, and they have the ability to stop it if they own the own the company.
Yes, and the same with the newspapers. The Gannett newspaper chain, which owns USA Today,
right?
They own about 90 newspapers across the United States, and I have had personal meetings with the officials of Gannett newspaper chain who are connected to the intelligence community, and part of all of this funding is to go in and buy control of the media. This is just like Hitler did with Goebbels, except it was official German policy after Hitler took over, but these guys do it through finances and the corporate world.
I understand.
With the covert operators in the background.
Right. I want to advise our audience, too, that we're doing a section on control of the media because it's so important and as pervasive as you described. But I very much appreciate you sharing this specific episode. And I want you to know that I share very much your concern about where the country's going, and we're doing this to try to set things right somehow. Do you have any notion of solutions? How are we going to solve this problem? If they're that powerful, how is a student or a teacher that's watching this going to do anything to make the world better for us?
I have sat on the Potomac River at restaurants with old, retired general officers, 70s and 80s, who were part of this when they were climbing the ladder of success. And now that they're getting close to death, they've got a conscience and start thinking about the hereafter and so forth. And I've had several of them tell me, Gene, and I've discussed this stuff in detail with them, what you're saying is absolutely accurate, but it's so big and so pervasive that you can't touch it. I guess if I totally believed that, I'd go off on some South Sea island and drink rum and cokes. And
you're still sitting here. We're talking about serious stuff. Go ahead.
The only way that I can see a really comprehensive way to fight these guys is independent media, newspapers and television, radio stations, and guys like you, university professors, people in the academic community getting together at a very high level where there's influence. I mean, some of the most prestigious schools in the country to start making noise. These guys do not. These guys are afraid of their position. That they think that any ripple will bring them down. That's why they're so quick to send somebody to prison or kill him if he becomes a nuisance to them, because they're afraid that somebody will grab one string of this wool blanket and run with it, and the whole thing will come unraveled. So they're psychologically they're insecure, but that makes them meaner because they'll do anything to protect their empire.
Well, I appreciate that. I've certainly dealt with enough ruthlessness looking at this problem, but I want to be even a little more encouraging to our audience, because in studying this problem, we've also run into a lot of American heroes, a lot of them, that are out there working for the truth. They can be liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican, is irrelevant. They love America. They're aware enough of what you've been discussing to be alarmed, and they're not they're not intimidated. They're prudent about the scale of what they're up against. And 99% of them, I tell you, Gene, have not been murdered. They may have been marginalized.
Right.
In the academic world, it's very easy to be pushed off to the edge. A lot of journalists are out there, freelance journalists now, because they used to work for CBS or somebody else, and they crossed this gray area that you described. But they're not giving up, and I have to comment on that, because we won't solve this problem if everyone just feels powerless.
Oh, absolutely. And the only other important thing that needs to be done is keep in mind that 95% of the people in the CIA, the State Department, the Pentagon, and police agencies around the United States are patriots.
They're decent people.
They just don't know. If you got this knowledge to them, to the middle level management and the working level people and the Pentagon and the CIA and the State Department and law enforcement agencies around this country, they wouldn't allow this to happen.
That's absolutely true, and we peck away at that, but I'll point out also that as time has gone on, they've been discouraged from open contact with the general public, and that makes it a little bit harder for us to get them to pay some attention to this. But that's part of the hope for our country. There's another example of this police state thing that we talked about during the break, and I want you to bring up because it's an example of dark side but also hope, and that's this Rex 84 and these executive orders that were put together by Ollie North to suspend the Constitution. Could you describe how that happened and why it hasn't actually come to pass?
Rex 84 was a readiness exercise 84 that was drawn up under FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and Ollie North co-authored the report along with the head of FEMA, Louis Giuffrida. Louis Giuffrida was a retired U.S. Army colonel, military police colonel, who, with Ed Meese and when Reagan was governor of California, was made the adjutant general of the state of California, and means he was the commander of all the National Guard in California. He was a colonel in the Army, but they made him a general in the California National Guard. And then when Bush and Reagan got elected in '81, they moved him to Washington and made him the director of FEMA.
Okay, we've got about a minute and a half at the most here.
Okay, well, FEMA had a plan to take 12 closed down, unused U.S. military installations across the United States and make concentration camps out of them, so that if they launched an attack any place in the world and the American people object to it, they would move in and take the leadership of the people who objected to it, and they estimated 250,000 people and put them in those 12 concentration camps.
Without trial?
Without trial. Now,
right.
This would be national security, that they would scarf them up. And this started to come out during the Iran-Contra hearings in Washington when Congressman Jack Brooks of Texas brought up the subject, and Senator Inouye of Hawaii, who was one of the chair of the Iran-Contra hearings, stopped him in mid-sentence after he asked about Rex 84 and suspending the Constitution. And they stopped the hearings and said this has to go into executive session because of national security information. Jack Brooks's teeth were pulled at that time, and he's never opened his mouth about it since then.
Well, an alert public has always been part of the formula for preserving our democracy. We're out of time here, but I want to emphasize that for our audience. You know, here was a plan for the police state, and it's not the only one that exists. But it hasn't happened, and one reason it hasn't happened, you know, those militia guys are passing around documentation on this. The left wing is very angry about it. And the point is, as long as we keep an eye on this sort of phenomenon and object when wrongdoing is occurring, I'm preaching the faith of democracy for our young students so they don't lose hope.
That's good.
So thank you very much for your help with this, Gene Wheaton, and thanks for your time watching Rethinking the World.
Ground Zero Minnesota is an all-volunteer education nonprofit dedicated to informed democracy and human survival. We organized in 1982 to deal with nuclear weapons issues, but have always supported education about human rights, the environment, corruption in governments, and other topics pertaining to war, peace, and human survival. We cannot guarantee the accuracy of opinions expressed by anyone on this series, but we screen them as carefully as we can and have concluded that their stories deserve a public hearing.